Welcome.
I have been, yeah.
You look tired.
I'm exhausted. 14 days fighting the government on your own is quite difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I've been really impressed by just your sheer energy, actually. I mean, there was a period, I think particularly in the days after, that you seemed barely not to be on the television or the radio arguing your case, and often in a very measured way, which, given all the pressure you've been under, was really quite extraordinary.
Well, I suppose I was a little bit upset at being sacked, I think. A bit of righteous anger there. It certainly got me going. Although I did love that comment when I did the Radio 5 phone-in at 10 o'clock on the Sunday night. One guy wrote in and said, "Get that guy Nutt off the bloody TV and radio. I'm sick to death of seeing his face." And I had a certain sympathy with him.
Was that Alan Johnson?
No, I don't know who it was, but...
I mean, I suppose the feeling must have been at the time when you were dismissed that it might be a story for a day or two, but would then kind of...
Well, I wasn't... Well, that may be what the government thought, but I wasn't going to... This is a serious business. I'm not doing this for publicity. I just took every opportunity I had to get my argument across. I'm still very angry. I think it was completely inappropriate. I still don't really understand why I'm sacked. I don't know. I mean, maybe other people... I see that other people from the council are here. They might have got a clearer view when they spoke to Alan Johnson yesterday. But it seemed to be something around the fact that he didn't like what I said, but he wouldn't specify exactly what I said. And I crossed this imaginary line, which seems to be wherever he wants to put it. So I still feel pretty hurt. You spend 10 years working for the government. You do huge amounts. I think I've probably been responsible for more legislation on drugs than any other person on the ACMD council, with the possible exception of Les King, who's also resigned. And then you can be dismissed at the whim because he, what was his words? Bold. I was bold, I was brave, and I was strong. Just dismissed me, over instantly with an email. And I was pretty disappointed. So that was anger rather than energy. And
you've had an awful lot of support, both from the scientific community, from politicians, from members of the public, and also an awful lot of supportive and thoughtful coverage in the press as well. But there's also been some kind of some stinkers, and I think one of my other favourites is this from Ian Wilson, who is often quite a sort of a measured and thoughtful person. But he wrote a piece in the Daily Mail on November the 3rd, and this is what he said. The only difference between Hitler and previous governments was that he believed in science as the only truth. I see the same mind at work in Professor Nutt and his colleagues as made those mad scientists of the 20th century think they were above the moral law which governs the rest of us mortals. Now, I have to say, I do have to ask this question. Do you consider yourself to be above the moral law that governs the rest of us mortals?
No. And I think where Wilson's wrong is that what I would say is that if scientists had stood up to Hitler, you probably wouldn't have had the Second World War. And it's quite an interesting analogy, because sometimes we do see scientists allowing themselves to be sucked into the political process because it suits their expediency at the time. They can get research grants, they can become sort of eminent for some period. But what I've done, and what other members of the council have done by resigning, is actually make a stand for science and trying to get science out of politics. And we haven't succeeded yet, but hopefully we will.
Now, if we perhaps just go back to the sort of the background to all of this, really, and I suppose starting with the original lecture that you gave back in July. My sense is that you worked quite closely at the time, or the Home Office was quite supportive in helping you put together that lecture, and indeed were very aware that you were delivering. Is that?
Yes, the lecture was put together with the full knowledge of the Home Office. I worked with the Secretariat. Some of them were supposed to be coming. Are they here?
Do we have? I think we have some representatives from the Home Office. I don't know if they want to put their hands up, or I'm not going to pick on you at this stage. Not at this stage, at least, anyway. But
is Will Reynolds? Are you here, Will? Because one of the real regrets about this is that I will no longer be working with Will. Will was a superb scientist, civil servant. I worked with him brilliantly for the last 2 years. He worked with me on the lecture, and I think that's why it was actually a very good lecture. He helped me analyse other data that Home Office had collected, and there was no question. It was the whole body of what I presented was fully embedded or fully emerged from science that I'd done, but also the Home Office had done. Yes.
And then we had a very interesting lecture. We went to publication, and all hell broke loose, really, didn't it?
Yes,
even
right.
on the day of publication itself.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you that what I said last Thursday week in terms of the press conferences was what I'd said the year before when we'd had the discussion about the ecstasy article, and what I'd said the year before when the Lancet article was published. When these guys said to me, well, we'll put the lecture out on the web and we'll see if we can get some press interest, I thought it was pretty unlikely, a bit grandiose of them. And they said, well, we'll try to get the Today programme. I said, forget it, you won't get the Today programme because they've heard it all before. So I don't know what you did. I don't know what.
I think it's probably you.
You got the Today programme, and then suddenly News 24, and then and then it just rolled on from there. And I still can't work out why it was so interesting, because everything I said was pretty straightforward. There was hardly any dissent from anyone who actually understood what I was saying. I suppose a few journalists, particularly TV journalists, kind of thought I was legalising LSD or recommending that, which I wasn't. But mostly it was just a straightforward presentation of the views of myself. And also, I think most of the people on the ACND, that effectively alcohol is the dangerous drug at present. Alcohol is a drug which is killing the majority of our children, or it's a drug which young people are going to suffer most from, and we should be doing something sensible about it, not messing around, worrying about, focusing on other drugs and distracting from the main challenge, which is to get alcohol misuse under control.
Now, you were dismissed the next day in an email from the Home Secretary.
Yes.
But
I did have a phone call to tell me to look at it, so it wasn't. Otherwise, I could have deleted it by mistake. That would be quite interesting.
Maybe your spam filter, or something. Yeah. But I mean, just
no. The Home Office questionnaires get stuck in the spam filter. But obviously, the Home Secretary gets through.
Just talk about your dealings with Alan Johnson and indeed his predecessor before that, because you sort of had let's say,
I had form.
I had a fruity relationship with him, didn't you?
Well, I'll just say, Alan Johnson, I met once. I met with him to discuss the problem of legal highs after the death from GBL of Hester Stewart, with GBL and alcohol combination. And I met with him to talk about the strategy that the ACMD was developing to deal with legal highs. And they're complex. There are lots of different ones. And we've worked very hard over the last 6 to 9 months to come up with some kind of knowledge base and strategy for dealing with them. A lot of that was pioneered, or that research, so that scientific analysis was developed by Les King, who's the senior chemist who's also resigned with me. But the meeting with Alan Johnson was about 3 months ago. It was great. I thought, fantastic. At last, there's a Home Secretary, A, who wants to meet me, because Jackie Smith never did, and B, is a sensible guy. He's got problems. He knows the issues, and he wanted us to help him solve them, because obviously he needs our expertise. And so it was quite disturbing to discover that what I thought was a sensible relationship suddenly had turned to very sour. And I don't know whether it was him or whether it was his advisors. It's hard to know. Was Jackie Smith a different kettle of fish? She never met me. I don't know why. But I did have a conversation with her, that famous conversation in my outpatient clinic, when she rang me and berated me for publishing this article where I said ecstasy was probably less harmful than horse riding. And it was an entertaining conversation, although having it in the middle of your outpatients, luckily there wasn't a patient in the room. I'd managed to get them out so I could give her my undivided attention. But it was one of those conversations when you wonder if your ear will ever, go back to normal. I mean, she's got a tough lady. I mean, she was obviously very upset at the time that her expenses problems were going into the Commons that afternoon, and I think maybe some people have suggested that she might have used me as a bit of a diversion for that. So I don't know, but it was a difficult conversation in the sense because we got into this what I called in my lecture the illegality logic loop, and the conversation sort of goes: how can you compare an illegal drug with a legal drug, or a legal activity like horse riding? So I say, well, if you're going to make something illegal, you've got to have some measure of harm, some threshold of harm above which it exceeds in order to determine it's harmful enough to make it illegal. But you can't compare illegal activity, illegal activity, but you've got to do that, otherwise, and you just didn't get anywhere. There was a really interesting sort of mismatch, and I've discovered this in many politicians, that many of them do struggle with the idea. Once something's illegal, it becomes a different kind of substance. It moves out of the realm of evidence. It moves into the realm of, I suppose, of theology, or I mean, that's what you call politics, I suppose. And very difficult to have that dialogue.
Now, Alan Johnson claimed that you were dismissed. I mean, so there's still some uncertainty about that, and I think there might be some work that one of the House of Commons committees will be looking at the reasons.
Well, shall I just explain a bit of that? I mean, it was an interesting letter because he didn't sack me. It turns out he couldn't sack me because the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't have a provision for the chair to be sacked. I imagine they thought, well, I don't suppose anyone could ever. I mean, I don't suppose it's never happened before, and it's very rare for scientific advisory committee chairs to be dismissed. So he asked me to resign. I thought that was not appropriate because I didn't think I did anything wrong. So I replied saying I was happy to have a dialogue with him, and it was a pity we couldn't agree where our boundaries were, but and left it open. So I don't think I haven't resigned. He says he sacked me when he went. He talked in the Commons on the following Monday, but. There's also the interesting issue of whether he could sack me, because in fact, as chair of that committee, I report to 4 ministers. I report to the Minister of Health and also the Scottish Minister and the Welsh Minister, because the committee deals with Scotland and Welsh drug issues as well. So none of those other 3 were informed. So it is a moot point as to whether I really have been sacked, but I don't suppose I'll ever get back in the Home Office anyway.
You've probably withdrawn your pass by now, maybe. And but I think the point you were making about the reasons for your sacking, I mean, the way that it was presented was as if you were some kind of special advisor to Alan Johnson, which is not really the case, is it?
No. I mean, for those of you who don't know, the Misuse of Drugs Act was quite a sensible piece of legislation enacted in 1971 with a specific intention of taking drugs out of politics, taking the issue of drug classification, drug harms out of politics. So an independent committee was set up that was charged with assessing drug harms, monitoring changes in use and changes in harms, and recommending classification to the government. And the government is legally obliged to take our advice, or at least it's legally obliged to seek our advice before it makes decisions about drugs. So it worked very well since 1971. It's only this government, the last 3 years, we've had problems. And we've had problems because government officials, from the Prime Minister down, have decided that they know the science and they don't need us to help them with that. And that's why we've started to get into difficulties, because when we've said, no, actually we know the science because there's 28 of us and we're scientists, or most of us are, and there's you and you're Prime Minister, but good as an economist as you are, you don't actually know the pharmacology of cannabis like we do. That's when we got into difficulties.
Okay, and then since the dismissal, it's been a sort of a kind of real roller coaster ride for you personally. We talked about that earlier, about just the sheer. I mean, you must have been more busy now than you've. I mean, it's.
Yeah, it's like having a baby. You're up all night, so you're up all day. But you don't get to talk to an audience when you're going. Yeah, no, it's but as I said, it's I feel passionately about this. I think I've been badly treated. I think the council has been badly treated. One of the things you need to remember is that this isn't just me mouthing off about my opinions. I mean, the lecture was my opinions, but the evidence base we've accrued over many years from the council has been extraordinarily solid. And it's insulting to that tremendous group of people for a Home Secretary to say, we actually don't believe what you say, we don't care what you say, we're going to do what we want. And this is the first government that has ever not taken the advice of the Advisory Council on terms of drug classification. So 37 years, even difficult decisions that were put to Margaret Thatcher in terms of things like needle exchange, completely antipathetic to Tory policy and Tory philosophy at the time, were accepted because it was seen that that was the best evidence we had that you could impact on drug harms. And we get this administration who starts telling us that we don't know about the science of drugs. except when we want to make drugs higher classification. So, everything's, as long as you keep putting it up, you're a good scientist. As soon as you want to say we should move some things down, then you can't do that because you're giving the wrong message. You're not letting people do things they shouldn't, This business is, this idea that the Prime Minister has that skunk is lethal. I mean, it's just, I don't know where it's just a bizarre idea. And, when we put him right on that, he got a bit flustered, but still determined, that you should be able to go to prison for 5 years for the third time you're arrested for possessing a joint, which is a kind of absurd penalty for something which harms pretty much no one. And if it harms anyone, it only harms the person who's using it.
You've attracted a lot of support from scientists and also a lot of public support.
Yes,
I mean, there's a Facebook. There's a support David Nutt or reinstate David Nutt Facebook site, which I think has, when I looked at it this afternoon, had over 25,000 members. And I remember at one point when I was looking at it last week, every time I clicked refresh, the numbers were going up and up and up. I guess you're a slightly unlikely sort of poster boy for kind of Facebook users in some way.
I think they like my moustache, some of them.
In fact, I think one columnist did say that we're losing a great moustache from public policy.
That's been fantastic. I mean, I have to say, I have been overwhelmed by the public support. Facebook, the Downing Street petition, the protest at Downing Street on Saturday. And
yes, the Downing Street demonstration, including a placard which said, "We support evidence-based drugs policy," which is not the most likely sort of policy.
Yeah, that's
and I rather liked one of the chants I think that was there, which was, "I'd rather be a nut than a Johnson." Is there anybody here who was at the demonstration? Oh, well, congratulations! And how did you find it?
Oh, it was great.
Yeah.
There seems to be support from people interested in science, and also people who maybe want to legalise the drugs as well. The support for scientists and freedom of speech, as well as support for rational.
And I think there was even a pantomime horse there as well. We'll get onto the microphones in a minute.
Yeah. But the other support that has been amazing is in people just finding out my email address and just emailing me. And it's been a bit of a chore hunting through them all to find the letters from the Home Secretary. But there have been so many, and 98% of them have said, fantastic, really respect what you've done, stood up for truth, said what you believe. And a lot of them have said, my wife's an alcoholic, I'm an alcoholic. The number of people declaring their alcohol problems has been quite compelling.
And in the last couple of days, we've had the Home Secretary's met with the remaining members of the Advisory Council. Apparently a constructive meeting, according to the Home Office. So constructive that 3 further members felt the need to resign. How do you kind of see things panning out now with the Advisory Council, and particularly its relationship with the Home Office?
Well, the Council's in a very difficult position because it's lost 4 of its... the chair plus 3 of its statutory members, and it's also lost the only chemist probably in the country that understands the spice issue. So it's going to be very difficult for it to do the science around legal highs. It's lost the chair of its working group that was looking at polydrug use. It's lost the chair of the working group looking at cognition enhancers, and it's lost the chair of the working group looking at early warning. So it's severely compromised. Predictably so. I don't know. I mean, it can't work until it re-establishes those missing people. I don't know whether people will stand up to the plate. I mean, I would be, unless the Home Secretary understands that there is a line between science and politics that he shouldn't step over, then it's going to be very difficult to get people in those positions. Well, why would people want to serve? Because if you serve, you're in this terrible bind, because even if you are telling the truth, people will suspect that it's the Home Secretary pulling the strings. And if you're not, well, you're sort of tired then. So I think the whole, as I said from the very beginning, I think sacking me actually made the functioning of the Council virtually impossible, unless there's a fundamental revision. As some of you may know, that the view I've taken is actually shared by the Chief Scientist, John Bennington, and after the debacle with Jackie Smith and the horse riding and the phone call, he wrote 2 very firm letters to the Home Office saying, this will happen again unless you do something fundamental, unless you separate scientists from government. So that his view is that the scientists, the council, should do the science. They should assess drug harms and come up with a classification system, maybe ABC, maybe ABCD, maybe whatever. And then the government should accept that, but the politicians should decide on penalties. So do you get 7 years for Class A possession, or do you get 6, or do you get... Yeah. And that's the right distinction, because scientists know about science and politicians, at least they do politics, whether they know about it, I don't know. So that's the... And Beddington wants that, and that was suggested, and the Home Office consistently, I think, have refused to engage in that debate. And I'm hoping maybe that scientists outside the Home Office, the broader scientific community in the government, and also, of course, the wide scientific community will actually begin to kind of knock some sense into them, really. So I don't know how it's going to pan out. I mean, I'm interesting to see what John thinks. He was there. He's a bit closer to the action yesterday than I was.
Okay. Let's open up to some questions. Now, we've got about 300 or 400 people here. If everyone speaks for 3 minutes, we're going to be here 20 hours. So no speeches, please. It's questions or reflections, but please keep them brief. We've got 2 roving microphones, so let's try and keep it dynamic. There's a chap up there, and then there's a woman in the middle and the striped brows. When you finish your question, please give the microphone back. Don't hang on to it.
I'm William Heath. I'm a supporter of Transform, the Drug Policy Foundation, and former chair of Open Rights Group. We funded Open Rights Group with an online pledge which said, I will put in a £5 a month to support a digital rights organisation if 1,000 other people will. You've got 25,900 supporters online. Should we have an online pledge to say we'll chip in a £5 a month to support an independent advisory council on drugs? And would you be happy to put your name to such an initiative?
Well, yes, I've said that I have thought a lot about this. I think in the current situation we need independent advice, because I don't know that the ACMD can provide the full range of advice it used to, because it's lost so much expertise. So I'm in the process of constructing some kind of plan to do that, and a number of people, some ex-ACMD members, have agreed to join me in that, and that's something I hope to make a statement about next week. I already said with at least one charitable benefactor has come forward and offered to underwrite it, but it's an interesting idea that we could get extra funding from something like, that's kind of pledge on Facebook, and I shall explore that. Yes, thank you.
Okay, the lady there, and then the gentleman there, and then the gentleman there.
Hello, Rachel Seabrook from the Institute of Alcohol Studies. You mentioned the problem with comparing legal and illegal, and the major communication problem you have there. I have a related point about equity. And as someone with a long-standing interest in the communication of risk, I loved that example. I thought it was a brilliant way of putting risk in context. But I was very surprised to find that my colleagues didn't like it at all. People without a scientific background felt it was irrelevant and inappropriate. And clearly there's a very major communication problem. And I'm wondering, not being optimistic that the other side are going to move towards scientists, what can scientists do to bridge that communication gap?
Well, I'd be interested to know what you said to your colleagues who thought it was an inappropriate analogy. Were you able to kind of work on them and get them to understand it, or is it just too entrenched?
One of my colleagues did discuss it with me and felt that it was wrong to abstract risk from other properties of the activities that we were talking about. I said, yes, we're talking about risk, we should abstract it, but he felt that was wrong. The conversation didn't go very much further.
And I think what you hit here is actually in many ways the nub of the problem. I mean, there's a triangular issue about drugs. In this triangle, this is the tangled triangle of drugs. There's a scientific corner, there's the moral corner, and there's the political corner. And people get screwed up between the three. And what a lot of politicians are doing is conflating politics and morality, and then trying to use science as a way of justifying those either overt or subconscious prejudices. And what we've said, the Council has consistently said, and certainly I've consistently said, is you cannot ask scientists to come up with evidence to justify a moral position. If you want to have take a moral position on drugs, fine. Just say, we don't like stealing for moral reasons. We don't like drugs for moral reasons. Forget the harms. But don't pretend you're making a scientific harm-based stance or judgment when you're only making a moral one. And that was, I think, the issue around ecstasy and also to some extent around cannabis. For Gordon Brown to say it's unacceptable to take cannabis, therefore we're going to make it Class B, is a truly bizarre statement. But getting back to so that's the origin of the problem. And getting back to the question of how best to express harms, I think is a really difficult one. We don't know what the threshold of entry into the act is. We know what drugs are outside: cat, caffeine, ice cream, and we know that inside the act are at Class C are drugs currently like ketamine, which may be actually too low. I don't know, and GHB and BZP will come into it. So we don't know that threshold. We haven't really defined the thresholds for the other categories as well. And all I was trying to do with the horse riding example was to try to reassure politicians that if they actually downgraded ecstasy, it wouldn't be a disaster. The world wouldn't end. People wouldn't be dropping dead in the streets because, people have been dying riding horses since presumably they were riding horses, and yet the world goes on. There's a bit of selection, of course. It probably, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but anyway, but. So I've been thinking, but horse riding may be a bit emotive. What really amused me about I don't know if you've read the article by Alan Johnson. He wrote a letter in The Guardian last Monday when he argued his case, and the letter was remarkable because that was the first time I really began to understand how politicians think. Because the last paragraph of his letter, he said, there are more deaths from ecstasy in my constituency than there are from horse riding, so I've got to focus on ecstasy. And the two things about that. One is he thought it, and therefore it was true. Because he didn't say there are 276. He has no idea. We don't know, and therefore he doesn't know. No one knows but more than that, he didn't understand that he's in the East Riding of Yorkshire. And I do think that is, it's called Humberside now, but I just thought historically, there was enough of that. Right, next question.
The chap there, then if you can just pass the microphone straight onto this chap in front of you.
Sunil Ramdare from Alcohol Concern. I'm going to speak on my own sort of opinions in case I get sacked. My chief exec isn't here, but it's quite similar.
Your secret is safe with us.
Thank you.
We'll just turn
I want to make the comment as to why I believe Professor Nutt was sacked, and it was something I used to work for local government, and someone said I saw things going on around me, and was like, how does anyone get sacked here? It's unbelievable. The answer was to know what you're doing. You clearly do. So that's why you've been sacked, as far as I'm concerned. The whole legality question, it's very similar to being gay. Prior to the laws being changed, it was the same argument. It's a moral argument. It's not a scientific argument at all. And that's what I tend to use. Go back to that, and people sort of start to click then. The other reason I believe for you being sacked is that you've dropped a massive bombshell. From Alcohol Concern's perspective, alcohol is this thing that is not highlighted in terms of the amount of deaths and the harms. I think it's 2.7 billion for NHS, 7 billion for criminal justice. The figures are astounding. 10,000 deaths from alcohol per year, almost 40,000 attributed to, yet, 2 or 3 from ecstasy? It's insane. It's actually insane. That's why you are so dangerous. And to what extent do you believe that your sacking was protectionism of the alcohol industry itself? Because what you've done is highlighted something very, very dangerous. That's my question.
Well, I think it's I don't think it would have been immediately affected by the alcohol industry, but you're right to highlight the fact that there's this pervasive influence of alcohol in society. We did a survey of politicians, of Commons politicians in about 1995, and we looked at the proportion who had interest in drink companies, and it was over 50%. And And I don't know if that's changed. It's difficult. It's harder to get it now because the drink companies are part of mega constellation, so you can't be sure that it's directly linked to the drink side of things. But there is this huge influence of the drinks industry throughout this society. And there's the way Liam Donaldson, the chief medical officer, where he came up in the summer with a very sensible set of proposals about how to reduce the harms of alcohol by appropriate pricing. The way he was stamped on within minutes of his proposals going into the public domain is very reminiscent of the way we were stamped on. And one of the reasons I was keen to promote that comparison of alcohol and cannabis last week was to give him a chance, to give his agenda, get his agenda back into the public domain. And then on Sunday, the Sunday week, I see he's on the Andrew Marr show. And Andrew Marr asked him 3 times, is Professor Nutt right? Is alcohol more dangerous than cannabis? And he deflects the question 3 times because he knows it is, but because he's a political appointee, he cannot tell the truth. And I felt so sorry for him, actually, because I am quite liberated now. I suppose I've always pretty much got close to the truth, but now I can tell it exactly as I believe it.
Hi, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We're very concerned of many things, but one thing we're concerned about is contamination of drugs.
Yes.
And the harm the contamination causes. I believe that if you've heard of Formula Cannabis soap bar, Dr. Russell Newcomb of the Lifeline Project estimates that it makes about 50% of the market, and it contains diesel, plastic, and sometimes ketamine, beeswax, things like that.
Glass
and
beads.
Has there been much research, and do you think the ACND should really look into the harm that the actual contamination causes? For example, also with cocaine, the amount of cocaine coming into the country is reduced, but the amount of cocaine being used has actually remained pretty much static, I believe. So therefore, it's being contaminated with all kinds of carcinogens.
We are concerned. I mean, we do look at that. We do get reports. We do try to follow them up, and we certainly. Because the most dramatic example of contamination were the outbreaks of Clostridium gangrene through intravenous drug injection of heroin, or contaminated heroin, about 6-7 years ago, particularly in Glasgow. So contamination there's no question, it's a big issue. It's difficult to deal with under the current legislation. I mean, the ecstasy review, when we published that, there were 2 recommendations the government rejected. One was the class, and the second was that we should try to explore the concept of drug testing stations like they have in the Netherlands, so people at least know what they're taking. With the cannabis contamination question, of course, another possibility would be to go for the kind of copy shops that sort of decriminalise it like they have in the Netherlands, which has been a remarkable social experiment. It's been running for 20-odd years. It's associated with lower levels of cannabis use than in most other Western countries, and it doesn't seem to cause any major health problems. And it may actually reduce the use of other drugs because you separate the market. So I think that's a very interesting approach. A difficult thing for the council to promote, and because there's no political will, but maybe we can begin to change that.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the chap up there, and then the lady in the middle there.
Okay.
And then me.
Yeah, I'm Patrick Murphy. I'm a research and performance manager. There's just been a few dissenting voices within the scientific community. I think of Robin Murray from the Institute of Psychiatry and Professor Parrott from Swansea, and they argue approximately that you've...
Could you speak nearer the mic? I can't hear you.
Yeah, they argue, Professor Parrott, Robin Murray, that you've underestimated the harm caused by cannabis and ecstasy. So I just wonder if you have any response to that.
Yeah, a couple of things I can say about that. It's very difficult for scientists who spend their whole life, or a large chunk of their recent life, trying to show drugs are harmful, to accept a more dispassionate view from people who haven't got that emotional commitment. And I think that's where the problem is. ACMD is a large group. It's 28 people, of which 20 or so have some kind of scientific medical therapy background. So when we do our analyses, we really do see it from many different dimensions. I think the problem with Robin and with Andy Parrott is that they are monocular, they just blinker, they see what they see, and then they extrapolate. So we look to the big picture and focus down, and they go out. So it may well be the case that in Camberwell there are issues about the incidence of cannabis as a consequence of smoking skunk that are problematic. But you can't generalise from Camberwell to the whole of the world. And with Andy Parrott's work on ecstasy, a lot of the early stuff was a sort of scaremongering that was floating along with a whole wave of concerns about how damaging ecstasy was, the whole Leah Bett story, which turns out to be just poor information to Leah and about what to do when you've taken ecstasy. I mean, she just was given the wrong information and it killed her. And as we've moved on now, we see, even Andy Parrott's own data begins to suggest that ecstasy doesn't seem to have particularly toxic effects, and certainly no more than the other drugs that people take, and probably less than alcohol. So, but I think the issue is that they have been very, very focused, and it's difficult for them to stand back and see the bigger picture. And of course, it's also been stoked up because it's very expedient. We saw the Home Secretary in Parliament saying that my views, which actually weren't my views, they were the views of the whole ACND, were not accepted by Robin Murray. So he was giving those views more weight than the whole views of his special advisor. So the Special Advisory Committee. So, there's another element to that, which is really just trying to diminish me by getting scientists that disagree with me. So
that's sort of, in a sense, one of the confusions, it seems to me, to have kind of happened through this whole process is confusing what are legitimate and important academic intellectual differences, because researchers will always disagree on things, and those are important. There's debates from basically an attempt politically effectively to smear you by replaying some of those academic disputes through the... Yeah,
and it's disappointing that the scientists fell into the trap. I guess if you ring them up, they'll always... There's a sort of legacy of disgruntlement that we didn't go along with what they wanted. But what they wanted in terms of classification of ecstasy and cannabis wasn't logical or scientific.
OK, now there's a lady in the middle. Can you promise to pass the microphone back down when you finish? And then the lady over there. And then there's a chap up
middle wave?
there. Yeah, the chap with the white hair and the glasses, yeah. So...
Hi, I'm Sue Atkin. I'm not involved in any organisation. I just wanted to ask, having accepted that drugs are harmful, doesn't the fact that all drugs are illegal make the problem a lot worse, in that it's a multi-billion-pound industry in the hands of gangsters and criminals whose interest it's in to push it on children or young people, and where users are criminalised and millions and billions of pounds of money is spent on keeping them in prison, and also where the fact that the drugs are contaminated makes them worse, like more harmful for people. So wouldn't it actually be a lot more sensible to, accept that the war on drugs is lost and that we should legalise all drugs and then use the money saved in more education and more sensible policies to get people off drugs?
That's a very interesting point, and you're absolutely right. A lot of the drug-related harms are caused by them being illegal and being run by criminal gangs. However, legalization, if it took the form of active promotion, as is currently what happens with alcohol and used to happen with tobacco, would also lead to potentially to bigger problems. So it's not a simple... So decriminalise. I mean, there's an interesting model here. There's a model that was used with alcohol in Finland until it joined the EU, which was that alcohol in Finland was sold by the state. It was regulated by limiting the times which you could buy it, so the alcohol shops didn't open very often. You couldn't buy it in supermarkets. And all the profit from the alcohol sales went back into research on alcohol. So that's an interesting model. Now, you could potentially look at that as a model for making other drugs available. I would agree with you there, but it probably wouldn't fit all drugs. I mean, I think it's an extremely difficult question to give you a straight answer to, a simple answer to. And I think what we do need is a working group, maybe a royal commission to really explore that question, because there's a lot behind it.
Right, now the lady there, and then there's a gentleman up there, and then I think what I'm going to do is ask Evan Harris to make some comments, and we'll come back to that. We've still got some time for further questions.
Hello, my name's Eleanor Levy. I'm a qualified practitioner in health and social care, and I work with homeless at the moment, and previously I was doing substance use work in prison and in probation. I recently got into trouble for criticising war on drugs, and I quite like the explanation of your triangle, which seemed to suggest why I'd gotten into trouble in that triangle with the science and politics arm. But do you not think that it's just the alcohol lobby is the entire reason, and there's a certain reflex? If you talk about classification of cannabis, you will activate the reflex. If you talk about criticism of war on drugs, you will, because underneath is implied, well, what about alcohol then?
Yeah, I think the alcohol lobby is, as I said, it's hugely powerful. It may have been behind some of the pressures to keep ecstasy as Class A. I think there was a time in the early 90s when the alcohol industry was getting genuinely worried that young people would switch from alcohol to ecstasy or other stimulants. There is this, I don't know if it's true, can't get the evidence, but there is a suggestion that the whole Leah Betts campaign, the posters was funded at arm's length by the alcohol industry. There's no question at that time the alcohol industry was promoting hooches and alco-pops with a sort of psychedelic feel to them, the dancing cat, which was banned eventually because it was seen as encouraging people into sort of dangerous or drug-related behaviour. So I think the alcohol industry does have a lot of overt and covert influences, and it's a tough one to break down because it permeates society so deeply. And hopefully this kind of debate we've got now will begin to get other people challenging them. I mean, there's more where you come from.
Mike Cushman from the London School of Economics.
Could you raise your hand? I can't see you. Oh, thanks.
Okay. If I can just broaden the canvas, at least temporarily.
Yes.
I was concerned that your sacking followed very quickly on the DCSF's, Ed Balls's rejection of the Cambridge University study on primary education, where we have a systematic problem, not just between the Home Office and the scientific community, but the whole of government and the academic community. One of the great promises in 1997 was evidence-based policy. By 2009, this has become a strident call for policy-based evidence.
No, you're absolutely right, and there's been a sea change from the early part of this century. Certainly got worse when Gordon took over, and I don't know. I mean, it may be the sort of desperate thrashings around of a dying government. I mean, I find it. I mean, I suppose if I was to say what's the most regretful thing of the whole sacking was I'd much rather have been sacked by the Tories. Too late now.
I think at that point...
we'll bring in the Lib Dems, who would never have sacked me.
Straight through the middle. So, Evan, would you like to...
So I'm going to sit over there?
No.
Oh, he's going to sit over there. Okay.
Thank you. With that introduction, I should explain that I'm a Liberal Democrat. I'm not used to an audience this size. So do bear with me, but since we're having to declare our interests and we're all sponsored, us politicians, by the alcohol industry, I have to say my sponsor is Carlsberg. Probably. This is, however, a serious matter, very serious, not just the way one person was treated, not just the way this very important advisory council, set up by statute, has now fallen into disrepair, but the whole question of whether what was understood to be the best way to do this after the BSE disaster and the Phillips report, which is where independent scientific advisors to government give them the scientific advice they need, not the words they want to hear, whether that has now been lost and how we can, and if it hasn't been lost in some departments, and I suspect in some departments there's been a move away from that, how the scientific world and the public can understand that it hasn't been lost, how trust can be found again. And what I want to do briefly is talk about the way forward, therefore, and I'm not going to talk about the rebuttal of the Home Secretary's comments and how I believe, and I invite you to believe, he misled Parliament on a factual basis, let alone an interpretive basis. But I do want to mention 2 websites where you can find this out, and that'll save Richard time. One is the principles that I'm going to talk about are on the Sense About Science website, www.senseaboutscience.org.uk, and you'll see them there, and a list of over 60 senior scientists who've signed these principles, which I'm going to mention. And the rebuttal and the destruction, I think, of the case that the Home Secretary made to Parliament is on my website, www.evanharris.org.uk. I promise that you don't have to wade through reams of proportional representation stuff to get to this story. It's on the front, and there's very little yellow. You can just go straight to that that story. So the reaction, I think, was right of the science community, and I do pay tribute to Tracy Brown there from Sense About Science and Colin Blakemore in the front here, who did a huge amount of work on drawing up these principles to say we've got a code of practice for advisors on scientific advisory committees, and there's a code of practice that's more detailed for the ACMD, and it is clear, reading that, and it's linked to on the website, that David Nutt didn't come anywhere near breaching the code of practice that is imposed on independent scientific advisors. But don't we need actually now a code of practice for politicians, for all parties to sign up to, not just for the party in office at the moment, to say that they're not going to interfere? And very briefly, those principles are, if I may, I'm just going to set them out here. Firstly, and this was, I think, right that the scientists should put this first, the principle of academic freedom. Becoming a member of an independent advisory committee does not reduce the freedom of an advisor to communicate publicly, whether via scholarly publication and conferences, through the general media or to Parliament, subject to the restrictions in the existing codes of practice. So as long as they stay within that, that's recognising confidentiality of material that's to be published, not claiming to speak on behalf of the government, and I don't think there was any doubt in anyone's mind that David wasn't speaking on behalf of the government, and not claiming to speak on behalf of the council when you're not in line with their position, and to make clear the basis upon which you're speaking, which David did every step of the way. It's so obvious that he did. And in the case of the ACMD, therefore, if you want to put this in ACMD terms, we invite the Home Secretary, essentially, these scientists, to accept that members are free to speak on drugs policy as long as they don't speak for the government. They're free to speak in a personal and professional capacity on any aspect of their work and their opinions where they have expertise. And members are free to speak with an ACMD label as long as they're dealing with agreed ACMD positions. The Minister is, of course, entitled to defend government policy, and good luck to him, but should do so without restricting the rights of any independent scientific advisor who disagrees with it to speak out within the code of practice. That should be something that every government minister should be able to sign up to, because it is recognising the academic freedom of academics. You'd think it was obvious. The second principle is the independence of operations, that independent scientific advisory bodies should be protected from political and other interference in their work. That means, I would say, not being bullied by getting a phone call in the middle of your NHS outpatient appointment from a politician who the previous day had had a headline in the Mail on Sunday saying Home Secretary lives with sister but claims whatever it was. It was the day after, an irate phone call like that interfering with your work, but also not political interference in the work of the body. And crucially, this is the critical thing, in the context of independent scientific advice, disagreement with government policy and the public articulation and discussion of relevant evidence and issues by members of advisory committees cannot be grounds for criticism or dismissal. Okay? That must be straightforward, because if you give a view and the government disagrees with it, it's still your view, and scientists can't change their view dependent on government positions if they're independent. The clue is in the syllable, as I said to the Home Secretary, not dependent on the government's position. And advisory committees need the access to the service of an independent press office, because I have to say, this may come as a shock, spin exists in government departments, and science really should try and avoid that as much as possible. So in the case of the ACMD, the Home Secretary must back off. And secondly, that if a member of the ACMD criticises government policy in a personal capacity, or is seen to do so legitimately in an ACMD capacity when he or she is speaking in line with ACMD published advice, then this should not be the basis for criticism or dismissal. A commitment is required that the Home Secretary will not publicly criticise an independent scientific advisor for their views without speaking to the scientist first. And no scientist who has not broken the code of practice should ever be asked to apologise for expressing their views. So otherwise, they will not tell Home Secretaries and others what they need to hear about nuclear safety, about swine flu, about BSE, about foot and mouth, about drugs. They'll tell them what they want to hear, as happened with BSE, and we will not have good policy, and there's huge consequences for public health and national security from that. Finally, proper consideration of advice. And these are, reports from committees will usually be published and will not normally be criticised or rejected prior to publication. If the government is minded to reject a recommendation, the relevant committee will be normally invited to comment privately before a final decision is made. It's recognised, and this is critical, scientists do not want to make policy. Okay? They don't want to run the country. It's recognised that some policy decisions are contingent on factors other than scientific evidence. Editorials in the tabloids, populism, ideology, manifesto commitments. Those are all legitimate in the world of politics. But when expert scientific advice is rejected, the reasons should be described explicitly and publicly, and it's not for politicians to argue the science when they're actually doing something else. And finally, the advice of expert committees does not cease to be valid merely because it is rejected or not reflected in policy. And there's a whole series of things in ACMD terms, which I don't have time to go into, that the Home Secretary needs to reflect on if, as John Beddington has said, and Lord Drayson, the Science Minister, has said, these are uncontentious and agreeable. That means not deciding the classification before hearing the evidence, not rejecting the advice before or as it is received, and a whole series of other things which I think a sensible politician would do. Now, if we can get that out of this disaster, and it has been a disaster, then I think we will have something credible out of this. I have to say that it is difficult in the world of politics because there's an obsession with what the tabloids say. But what's most interesting is the public support for David and the way that he and colleagues, in a very difficult area with not much advice on how to track through this minefield, how they've performed, with the support of major signatories. The signatories to these principles include Lord May, a former Chief Scientific Advisor, Lord Rees, who is the President of the Royal Society, Professor Sir Mike Rawlins, David's predecessor in that job and now the Chairman of NICE, Nobel laureates like Sir Paul Nurse, and a series of other senior scientists which you'll find on the page. If you know anyone who's given advice to government who wishes to sign that as a sign of endorsement of those principles, then please let them know about that website. Thank you for giving me the chance to say what I think a constructive way forward will be, and we need all political parties to be measured by the respect that they have for these principles. Thank you.
Now, we also have John Marsden with us, who resigned just yesterday from the ACMD. But I think his preference would probably be to, if Sylvia, maybe we can have the microphone down and you can sort of...
Oh, do you want to
or maybe...
Yeah, go there, John. Go.
Okay.
He's normally used to someone holding the microphone for him when he does his TV shows, you see.
My caravan's outside, which I'll be returning to for a shiatsu massage shortly. I haven't made a speech, so good evening, everyone. And I was saying, can I sit down? Because I felt more comfortable. But I will use this opportunity to reflect, if I may. And I'm super delighted to be invited. David called me yesterday. It was a really long, tough day, a really hard day, and it was with great regret and sadness that tendered my resignation when I managed to battle home through the press throng outside the Home Office to my house and tapped out my letter. And David kindly invited me, and I thank you, Richard, for the invitation. So I don't generally like raking over leaves. I'm one of those people that says, oh, God, that was, when we lose, when our team loses on the Saturday, we say, OK, what's next week? And I think you would, though, expect me to characterise for you why I resigned. It seems to be appropriate and in the public interest for me to tell you that. And I think I'd use this opportunity to just reflect and maybe just underscore some of the points that I really enjoyed hearing that Evan just made, and also my dear colleague David just made. And let me say, first of all, I'm a jobbing academic. I'm a researcher in the addictions. I work at the Institute of Psychiatry, and I try and, I suppose I draft persuasive communications, grants, that try and persuade governments of this particular country to sponsor me to do work in this field, which I'm, if you like, a career scientist in. I chose to come into this field, and I've so far been able to stay in it. I hope I continue to be able to contribute to. My own particular interest is to understand harms. That's at the core of any person, I think, that's an addictionologist. But I'm interested in how we think about, go about, and understand the effectiveness of treatments for people with addictive disorders. So when I can't quite remember how long it was that I served in the ACMD, to my embarrassment. I should check. I think it was about 5 years. And I was so thrilled and honoured to be invited. And I'm also a journal editor. I'm one of the senior editors for Addiction, which is the Blackwell-Wiley monthly title. It's a specialty journal in our field. And we, as a group of unpaid editors, are part of a very merry team of scientists from many disciplines in the editorial offices across the world, really, for addiction, that follow a very closely articulated and implemented code of conduct. We're very concerned about principles of ethics of publishing and, in a sense, the ethicality of public life as a scientist, full disclosure of any potential bias, conflicts, who we're paid by, and which committees we may serve on. So I'm someone that takes my responsibilities very seriously, and I if it's not a horribly cheesy throwaway, I think I'm a conviction scientist, and I know we live in an era of conviction politics. So when I was invited to serve on the council, I mean, first of all, I instantly accepted. I was delighted to serve, and I wasn't sure what it was going to involve, but I knew it was important, and I knew that the people on it I respected greatly, and I think it's important to note, they then and now, and perhaps in the future, they constitute an expertise body. I mean, it's easy to some extent, do a disservice to the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs by calling it scientific. It certainly has scientists in there. I humbly regard myself as a member of that group. But it's also got people that spent a professional lifetime, developing services, for example, and have managerial expertise, policy knowledge, and indeed people that have actually been part of the process and departmental infrastructure of government. So it's an expertise body, and it follows a method of science, I think, in that it asks questions that can be addressed through the collection of information and so forth. That, I know, is known. And there's also a code of conduct, and I scurried quickly to read that to make sure that I wasn't going to put my foot in it as soon as I turned up at one of the various hotel meeting rooms that we normally take part in, or I used to. And it was very clear to me that there was it appeared to be a clear separation, but then a worrying grey area that related to two parts of my life to come. One, my continued professional life as a journal editor, an academic, a published author, and I suppose a member of the scientific community. So that's sort of JM speaking as John the academic. And then what was I going to do if someone asked me to comment in public about the work of the ACMD? So it would be John, the council member. And it didn't seem to me very difficult at all, actually, to distinguish how I was going to do that. You simply add a prefix to whatever comment you got, which is, well, in my position as reader in addiction psychology 4 miles south at the Institute, my view is this. And it happens to be based on a thorough digest of the evidence. So there you are. And if it's the council, where there was an incredibly detailed and, super energetic support by the Secretariat. David mentioned Will Reynolds and several other people supporting Will, and they were absolutely extraordinarily supportive and with great humour enabled us to understand our responsibilities. So then it would be, well, on the council, we've been tasked by the Home Secretary to look into a particular topic, and we're doing that. And you wouldn't generally say much more, but you would say that our purpose is to kind of winnow the evidence and make recommendations. So it seemed to me reasonably easy to demarcate the two lines. And I think, I mustn't overstate my welcome, so I can hear you thinking, get on with it then, get to the point. So look, what do we want? I'm a member, I live in South London, I'm a member of society, I work in this field, I'm an addictionologist, okay, fine. But I'm also someone that votes, and I'm someone that really has been proud to hear that government wishes science and technology to be at the forefront, at the heart of our national recovery, if you like. So I'm a passionate believer in science, and I know that, as Evan said, it's a great turnout, and I know that you are all part of that public understanding of science, and you are all shaping the debate and all contributing to it in a way that I absolutely believe in. And that's the fabric of our democracy. The European Commission, I didn't like the report, unfortunately, but they invited me and some colleagues to do a review of drug misuse research in the European Union, looking at the different countries and the sorts of outputs that have been generated from the resources given. And you know what? We punch way above our weight in this country. I often look with incredible envy to North America, to the US, and the federal government there devote a very considerable amount of their GDP to addiction research. I believe much more relatively than we do. But whatever resource we get, we really generate great stuff. And that report really did articulate the UK as a very good deliverer of research material in this particular field. So I feel that science has an important part to play. I'm an ethical person, so I'm sitting at my computer hoping that 6 o'clock's going to roll up and I can crack open a can of beer, get my Xbox out and chill out. And then I get a note saying, hold the phone, David's been sacked. And I typed back. I'm one of those real-time email people that really are annoying now, in that I use it as a sort of an alternative to speech in a way. So I pecked out a reply that said, "You've got to be kidding. Has he been sacked?" It didn't look like it from the letters. And so once it became clear, I then sat back and thought, well, I'm off. That's me. I'm done. You can't sack somebody for... Well, it appeared to me you couldn't be sacked for not breaching a code of conduct. I couldn't see how, in his capacity as a chair of neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College, that you could be an academic published author or deliver a lecture, which is then written up, and be regarded by any reasonable person here or in the rest of society as staging a campaign against government. It didn't make sense. So I thought there'd been some horrible category mistake that in some naive way would be repaired quickly. I'd sort of wake up and Will said, just joking, have a good weekend and it's all okay. And then it was clear that was not going to happen. My immediate thought then was that I'd have to go as well, because it occurred to me that it could easily be me. Now, I don't have the platform that David has and the visibility. I'm much more, kind of League Division I don't know. But
you're much slimmer too.
But maybe I could. I mean, in fact, I've made a telly programme a long time ago in which I compared ecstasy to slalom skiing and dangerous sports, you know, and but you know what, whenever I do that, I do think of a parent that's lost a loved one. The thing about drugs is it's a bit like swine flu. Many of the drugs we're talking about, they're not really that dangerous unless they kill you, okay? And it's so difficult to think about risk. Numerically, it's very hard to understand the drivers of risk. And we often reach for analogies, and I respect David's choice. I think it's a fine one. And it doesn't in any way, I think, fail to reach out and understand the plight, misery and suffering of people that have addiction or have been affected by it in their families. But it is a device, and I think there's been tremendously positive reporting of it in the recent days. It is a device to open up a debate about how we calibrate differences and why it is patently absurd to have a bloated top class A for the Misuse of Drugs Act with a number of other drugs that are sort of desperately trying to go northwards into it. It's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned from a logical point of view, and we need a new approach. So I decided that it was important to meet with Council, and that was the scheduled meeting which was held yesterday, because I wanted to meet with the other members and discuss the events that had preceded David's sacking and the discussions in the press and within government subsequently. And that meeting was a closed meeting. It was attended by the Home Secretary, and we had a full and frank discussion. And it is not for me to tell you about... That was a closed meeting. What I will say is that I resigned because I believe in the principle of free scientific speech in this country, and I believe David is guilty of no perforation of any code of conduct that relates to the operation of the scientific advisory committees. And what I think we've got is these kind of sort of planetary bodies, and they don't really, you know, sit comfortably in their orbits. The planetary body of science and the planetary body of politics. And it must be really hard to be a paid senior scientific advisor and have to tread the line between rational debate and thought, and sometimes the fearful moral stance of the day and the playing to the gallery of the certain sections of the press. I wouldn't envy that. I much prefer, and I actually feel quite free now to go back to my day job and get on with generating evidence and hoping that I can have an audience for it. So I felt, unfortunately, that I wasn't reassured that the same dismissal couldn't occur in future. Wasn't able to be reassured by that. But that's all I'm going to say about that. That was my personal view. And I hope, though, that the remaining members of the Council are able to continue their work in whatever way they can. But for me, I couldn't take part further in that. And I felt in good heart about that decision. I'm sad not to be part of that debate anymore, but I'm not going away, and I'll continue to try and persuade governments to deploy their hard-earned cash to do clinical trials that I'm able to do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, John. I have to say, if that's an unprepared speech, I'd love to hear one of your prepared speeches, because it was incredibly articulate and thoughtful. So thank you very much. Now, we have about sort of maybe 10 or 15 minutes more for sort of Q&A and discussion. And I want to kind of give everyone as much chance to do that. So I just simply kind of as a way to tee up that sort of bit of our conversation. I mean, I was really struck by what John was saying there, David, about that kind of sense, and I don't want to misrepresent what you're saying, John, so I hope I'm not doing so, that engagement with government feels oppressive rather than liberating, at least in the context of the recent developments within the ACMD. And it seems rather important that's not the case. So where do we go from here, in your view?
Well, I think we have to resolve, or try to resolve, the Home Office problem. I'm certainly not the only leader of a Home Office scientific advisory panel that feels that they've not been not had their opinions properly taken into consideration by the Home Office. I think we've got to get a set of guidelines properly endorsed across the whole of government, because if it could happen to me, I presume it could happen to anyone. I mean, I guess to some extent there is an element of some particular irritation with me by either the Home Secretary or by the people who are advising him, and it may be that there's some legacy back from the days of Jackie Smith, but that could happen to anyone else. So I think we've really got to make it very clear that there is a line. And when we were in the Commons today talking to politicians, I asked them, well, the sanction for me crossing this line, which I couldn't see, in fact I didn't cross, but anyway, the line that was drawn around me was sacking. But what's the sanction for the politician crossing the line into the scientific arena? Well, there is no sanction. And unless there's an appropriate balance of power, we can't work together. It's to sort of use sort of psychological kind of, it's parent-child. In fact, I felt like a serf, and I felt like, Johnson was the sort of lord of the manor, just casted me aside when I was, I said something inappropriate to his wife or something. So that kind of feudal arrangement is so archaic, and I just think it has to change. And I'm hoping that Beddington and Drayson can, with the help of the external scientific group, pull something together. Because if they don't, things actually may not get better.
Okay, thank you. Right, now we have some more questions. The chap with the glasses there who's been waiting a long time, and then I think you, sir, as well. And then we'll take a couple from over there.
Hello, my name's Paul Goodwin. I'm from an organisation called PsyComp Academic. We're starting, it's a new organisation where the idea is we're going to try and link up graduate students with psychedelic research as it happens. Yeah. Now, I recall fairly recently you writing in the BJP with Ben Sessa about the idea of looking at MDMA as a clinical adjunctive to psychotherapy. Now, this sort of thing obviously frightens all of us that are involved in this sort of research. A few of us have started to poke our heads out and say, look, we do think, like yourself, we do think these are things that need looking at. And one thing that worries me is we're going to be left behind. Like, at the moment, you've got Peter Gasser in Switzerland working with LSD in clinical trials. You've got Mithofer in America and John Halpern working with MDMA and LSD for cluster headaches and PTSD. Now, this is a frightening thing for us that we're hoping to bring these things to some sort of a clinical attention. How do you feel that this has set that back?
Well, I don't know whether this particular incident will have changed things very much. I mean, the problem we've had, another issue with the misclassification of drugs like ecstasy and almost certainly LSD, based on our harm matrix, is that it's virtually impossible to research on them because the controls that you need to put into place to hold a Class A drug are so oppressive that, for instance, I wanted to do a study. We have done a study, the first study of psilocybin in the UK in 30 years. We've done a study to show you could use it to ask questions about the effects in the brain. Then I wanted to do a brain imaging study with it at UCL, and they wouldn't allow us to do the study there because they didn't have the license, and they didn't want to get involved with the holding of it. So the classification has this other impact. It really deters science. Also, the drug is extraordinarily expensive. I mean, it's £3,000 for 100 milligrams. So everything, because it's a Class A drug, it has to be prepared and it has to be held in special secure sites where it's made. So the whole business of studying the utility of these drugs has been thwarted. And that's when I talk about the negative consequences of the precautionary principle. That's one I didn't talk about in my lecture at King's, but that's a really important one. We have these drugs, particularly MDMA, it was developed as a psychotherapeutic tool. Its research with it disappeared when it was put into the Misuse of Drugs Act, and it's extremely difficult to bring it back. And I have patients who say to me, the only time I feel normal from my depression is when I take MDMA or ecstasy. Can I study that? Virtually impossible. So we've missed 30 years of potential quality research because of this misclassification. And there's another reason I quite want to keep speaking out about it because it's something that people don't know much about, but it's a very big negative impact on research.
You haven't resigned from the Beckley Foundation, have you? You're an advisor to them as well?
Yes, well, they actually they funded the psilocybin research, that's right, yes.
Thank you. Right, the chap in the green shirt and then the chap in the...
I'm Rowan Bosworth Davis from an organisation called LEAP, which is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
Uh-huh.
I believe I'm right in saying that there is, in fact, a government website called something like the Number 10 Strategy Unit.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Which has got all the information about cannabis and alcohol, the very things that you have recently reopened. It's already there on a government website.
That's right.
Proving that they already know about these risks.
Of course they do. Yes.
I wonder if it will still be there this evening when we go home to look.
Well,
the issue is no one has disputed the facts that alcohol is currently a bigger health problem than cannabis or ecstasy or LSD. No one has disputed that. But what they've been angry about is the fact I've said it, and it is the problem of free speech.
But if you ask any police officer, they'll tell you that alcohol is far worse.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but the police haven't covered themselves in glory in any of this. The police have, as soon as the suggestion has been that we might change the classification, the police have always backed off. 15 years ago, ACPO said, let's downgrade ecstasy, but then when we asked them to support us in doing it, they backed off. Same with cannabis. So the police do tend to play a kind of political game, and it's good that there are some of you who actually prepare to stand up for science.
Thank you. Now, the chap there, and then there was a chap in the blue shirt. I don't know if you wanted to, and then...
Okay, you write an article, Professor Nutt, you write an article this week in the Sun newspaper about a safe alternative to alcohol that you're developing. Given that governments around the world have consistently prohibited safer alternatives to alcohol, such as cannabis, and they'd rather listen to people like Deborah Bell from talking about cannabis than Professor David Nutt, what makes you think they'd show any interest in pursuing this route?
Well, I don't know if they'll show any interest, but you've got to keep telling the truth, and it would actually be not difficult to make an alcohol substitute that was better than alcohol on three main planks. It wouldn't cause death by toxicity because you'd have from overdose because you'd have an antidote. It wouldn't rot the liver and the heart and the blood vessels and the skin and the brain, and it wouldn't cause dependence. That's a tractable problem for pharmacology, and the reason no one is working in that field is because companies haven't been given any kind of reassurance by governments that they would be allowed to sell a drug. And what I want to say, and what I will continue to say, is that if governments want to reduce the harms of alcohol, they need to think of another social intoxicant that's much safer. Now, I think that's a perfectly reasonable, sensible, scientific position to take. And I will keep banging on about that, and hopefully at some stage, some country, maybe Scotland, where they're at least moving in the right direction in terms of pricing, would be prepared to take it up. But, it's a message that needs to be promoted, because there is this paradox that alcohol isn't controlled, and therefore you can't compete against it.
I'm Sam Yakulai from King's College London, and I view drugs as a moral non-issue, similar to homosexuality and assisted suicide for terminally ill. Saying that, I'm from the US, but I think the US and the UK both like to espouse how we have such great personal freedoms for everyone. Do you personally think that drugs should, for personal use, not for selling, but for possession and personal use, do you think the government should be in play in that arena?
Well, I have difficulty in understanding why you would want to put someone in prison, which is what sanctions mean, for possessing a drug that either they're using to have fun with, or they're using because they're addicted to it. I mean, it doesn't seem to me either of those, that prison or punishment of any sort is a sensible sanction against either of those options. And so I think the idea of decriminalising for personal use, as they've done in countries like Portugal, seems to make sort of moral sense, and it probably makes scientific sense as well. And I think, frankly, it would make political sense if any of the politicians had the courage to actually really tackle it and present it that way.
Thank you. The chap in the red shirt, then you, sir, and then I think there's a couple of people just yet.
Yes, red shirt.
I feel a little bit like I've wandered into a meeting of the temperance movement, because alcohol is being widely discussed as kind of cause of social breakdown. And Professor Nutt, you say that the government has mixed up science and morality, but I think some people here, including yourself, are also crossing the line between science and morality, because I accept that academic research can show the impact alcohol has on society, although I think it tends to be one-sided. But it is then a moral and political judgment, it's a moral and political leap to then say that prices should be increased as a solution to that, or that it should be there should be prohibition for under 21s, which you've also suggested. And that's a morality which would disproportionately punish poor people and young people, which makes it even worse. So I just wonder, could other people in this room also be accused of crossing that serious line between science and moralising?
Yeah. So a couple of points here. One of the roles, well, as an individual scientist, I think it's perfectly sensible for me to promote views about how you could reduce the harms of alcohol. And my comments about increasing the drinking age to 21 is based on an amazing body of evidence from the USA, where most states have done that. And the estimate was, in the first 10 years of increasing the drinking age, 170,000 lives were saved. Okay. Because people didn't kill themselves in road traffic accidents predominantly. So if people are interested in a evidence-based approach to reducing harm, that's one. Okay, but I do take the point. It's all we can do as an individual scientist or as a council is put evidence to government, and if a government chooses not to pursue it, well, that is either a moral decision they're making or a political decision. But you can't get away from the fact that there is the arbitrary exclusion in this country of alcohol from the Misuse of Drugs Act leads to it being very, very heavily marketed and therefore causing a lot of damage. And of course, in many countries in the world, it is illegal. So you've got plenty of examples in Muslim countries where it's illegal. So yes, in that sense, it's the decision not to classify it. That's where the real moral ambiguity comes.
Thank you. Right now, I think we're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to take a few final questions. There's a chap there, and there's a lady in the middle. And then I think
we
should call it closed.
I'm Colin Blakemore, and have worked with Dave a bit on the Lancet paper on harm matrix and so on. I think what's happened to you, Dave, is a scandal. But I have to say that given that politicians these days seem to have antibodies to contrition, the chance of getting the situation reversed for you is rather low. So what I think we need to focus our minds on and our activities on is the broader issue of how this can be turned into something positive. And the potential positive outcome is to set this government back onto a track that it so clearly adopted in 1997. I mean, it's easy to rubbish the government for what they've done to you and their apparent stupidity in some of the things that have been said about evidence recently, but this government has doubled money for science. It made a very firm commitment to evidence-based policy following a BSE. And the fact that we're here at all capable of having this argument, that organisations like the Science Media Centre and Sense About Science exist, is testimony to the transparency that's been given to the relationship between government and science over the last few years. I really think one should see this as a setback in what was actually a very positive direction of movement in the relationship between government and science. So what I'm arguing for is to see the broader issues, and there are some very, very important ones, but to try to keep the government on board and not alienate them too much in our discussions with them, because until Evan here is Science Minister, they are certainly the best thing that's in town for science.
So I'll translate that for you. What he's saying is going to get a lot worse if the Tories get in. Well, Grayling said I should have gone sooner. Yes. Please. It's on.
Paul Beckett, former student of King's College. One of the things I'm quite, I guess, almost staggered by here is that we talked a lot about social harm and about the harms from drugs, but it was alluded to in a question earlier, we've completely ignored the harms on the producer countries. And if you accept the balloon effect that pretty much no matter how successful you are in tackling supply, it would just shift to another country, the consequences in terms of failed states everywhere from Mexico to West Africa is, I would argue, far greater than a few people having schizophrenia in the UK, and that needs to be taken into consideration when deciding drugs policy.
I agree with you. And one of the things that we have done, and for the Council, which has now been aborted, is try to develop a more sophisticated harm matrix based on multi-criteria decision-making, one strand of which is to look at the international perspective. That was a major part of our work over the last year, which I don't know if it'll come to fruition now because of my sacking. But you're quite right. That is a really important issue, and we've taken it on board. Well, we were taking it on board.
Final question there in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Denise Leavesley. I'm head of the School of Social Science and Public Policy here at King's. I'm speaking from the perspective of a professional statistician, and I wanted to follow up on what Colin Blakemore said.
Yep.
And I think there are some opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
We have had problems in statistics of erosion of trust.
Yes.
We've had enormous problems in terms of independence of interpretation, political spin.
Yes. Yeah.
And what we've done, we're not completely successful, but what we've done is we've actually got together as a statistical community backed by the profession, and we fought very hard across all of the political parties for statistical legislation, for codes of conduct, and also for an independent statistics authority to be established that investigates breaches. And I just wanted to say that I think that there are some examples of where we've had some successes.
Now, let me be very clear. This government has actually done a lot for drug treatment. This government is the first government that's really endorsed the principles of harm reduction. It has made huge progress in facilitating and the availability of treatment, particularly for heroin addicts. I don't knock this government at all. In terms of that, it's done a great job. But it's got really hung up on this issue of classification. And that's because the science is bedded in the wrong ministry. Health has been able to accommodate evidence. The Home Office has really struggled.
Thank you. Now, I think this is in the business, what's called in the business breaking news. I've just been passed a note saying Johnson has just released another statement. Man from Sky has it and wants to make comment. So those of you who've actually stayed with us, Man from Sky.
Hello, Tom Rayner, Sky News. We don't have the full statement, but the reports appear to be coming through that a joint statement was issued tonight, signed by both the Home Secretary and the remaining members of the Advisory Council. And what appears to be the case is that the issue of whether or not drug advisors have the freedom to publicly criticise government policy has been referred to the Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor John Beddington, to report to the Prime Minister by Christmas. Professor Nutt,
funny present.
What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think John won't take that long. Because he already knows what the answer is. So,
Do you welcome it?
Well, I do. I think Christmas is a ridiculously long time. I mean, that does worry me that may be a way of slightly taking the heat out of the current situation. But I could be wrong, of course.
Into the long grass.
Into the snow.
The Home Secretary, just to add to that, has, it appears, agreed to implement the recommendations, although obviously we don't know what those are yet.
Are the recommendations of the Drace?
That Professor John Beddington would come to in the course of his report.
The recommendations, I presume, we wouldn't have allowed him to sack me in the first place. But since I'm not sacked, maybe I should just carry on as ever.
Well, thank you for that. I like to think in our own small way we may have contributed to that breaking news, and all of us in this room this evening. It just really goes for me to thank you all for coming. Now, we as an organisation, the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, are going to be pursuing this issue with David and with others. And if you want to be kept in touch with that, do fill out the form that you have there. You can subscribe to our free monthly bulletin, and you can get all the updates on that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
And finally, for those of you who want to contribute to history, we have a camera that's going to be doing the rounds, asking people, what do you think of this then, and how do you think your way forward? We're going to be editing it overnight, or so I'm told, and putting it all up on our website tomorrow. Now, if that works, I will be really impressed. But there's going to be a camera doing the rounds. Make yourself known if you want to kind of have your say. Thanks very much.
I was absolutely appalled by the sacking of Professor Nutt and the anti-scientific antics, I suppose, of the Home Secretary.
Professor Nutt was brilliant. I was very impressed with what he said, and I hope that he gets to have a louder voice and that the country listens. And I hope that this has spurred on a more sensible debate about drug policy.
From Students for Sensible Drugs Policy. We completely support David Nutt's view that evidence should be at the forefront of deciding on any policy related to drugs.
The honest debate is so honest and true.
It's a political scandal.
Most people back it, you know what I mean? Not just obviously the public, but from across the spectrum, I think.
I think he set out his position really clearly, and I think it pointed out the sort of how ludicrous the government's position was, certainly Alan Johnson's position.
And I would like to know whether it is legal, whether he's been sacked or not. Does it show something if you're in the government, you do what you like?
I work for a group for empathy, which are the friends and family members of drug users. I'm actually the chair. And I thought that a lot of his points were very, very valid, because I see it not from the government point of view, but from the people's point of view.